And she remembered that for a few terrible nights with her toddler and her really newborn baby alone in this cottage, husband away in the war, she had cried and cried, and she it was who had turned her face to the wall and banged her head on the wall until blood flowed. And so she, this lady, alive, still alive in her 80s, was a ghost. Some aspect of her experience of trauma was still in the cottage that she'd lived in the 1940s.
Former guest of the show, Neil Oliver, and the author of the new book, Hauntings, a book of ghosts and where to find them. Neil, welcome back to the Freedom Pact podcast, my friend.
Oh, welcome to you too. It's lovely to see you. I enjoyed our conversation the last time, and it's been too long. So anything you want to chat about is good for me.
Fantastic. Well, as you mentioned there, you've been on the show twice before, first in 2020 and last going out in 2021. So, yes, it's been a long time coming. Really appreciate you coming back. Today, we're going to be talking about something a little bit different from our last episode. Our first episode focused on your book, Wisdom of the Ancients, which is a book I recommend to so many people, and I've bought probably so many times as gifts for people. One of my favorite books. But today we're talking about this new book, Hauntings. Now, for a lot of people, they may be turned off by that idea, but this book, it doesn't aim to convince anyone of anything, and it doesn't really aim to debunk any of these stories. So for anyone out there listening now who is thinking about instantly, dispelling this subject and listening to these stories, what would you say to that person who may just not be open-minded to these types of conversations?
It's an excellent place to start the conversation, Lewis. Broadly speaking, I reflect the tone of your introduction there. What I can say is that I've always been open-minded. That's really, or perhaps I should say I'm agnostic in the sense that I find it hard to come down hard and fast either side of an argument, because I'm always affected by and influenced by the last person I talked to, because I'm always interested, especially where someone speaks to me passionately or seems to come at me or to me from a position of having read a lot, seen a lot, been around the houses, having a lot of experience. And I'm always disinclined to dismiss a point of view at all. I'm just always enthralled to listen to someone talk passionately about something. And the simple fact of the matter is, because of the kind of television that I've made in the past. Now, I started making history of a historical, archaeological flavour in around 2000. So it's been quite a while. And although I hadn't really spoken about it or written about it before, the truth is that over and over again, contributors that I spent time with during a filming day. Now, filming days can be quite long. If you're out on location, middle of nowhere, on a hillside, on a battlefield, on a cliff top, everyone's taking a long time to get into position. You're dependent on the weather, you're dependent on all sorts of things to get the filming just right. And it means that you end up during the course of a day with a contributor, someone that's going to be your interviewee for the day. You spend maybe an hour talking to them on camera, but in the gaps in between, you spend the whole day chatting to the person. And I'm talking about sober academics, serious scientists, regular folk like you and me, all kinds of people from every walk of life. And I could not help but notice down through the years that one person after another, in a gap in the filming, would say, don't tell anyone, but the funniest thing happened to me here a few years ago. And out would come what you or I, most people would call a bit of a ghost story, a bit of an encounter with something that person couldn't rationally explain. And over the years, 20 years or getting on for it, I just collected quite a compendium of stories like that. And I thought, there's something worth investigating here. Mm. And the people that I was talking to, some people were completely sold on the fact that they had seen a ghost. Other people recounting an anecdote were just unable to explain exactly what it might have been that had happened, the feeling they'd had, the thing that they had glimpsed, whatever, the experience that had unfolded. And I thought, I'm going to write these down. And that was that's the backstory for Hauntings.
Yeah. And what really drew me into the book is this is a subject area that I'm not very familiar with. I've never have been. Traditionally, if you'd asked me, do I believe in ghosts? All my young years and my adult life, I would say no. But as you mentioned there, when you speak to someone who's quite passionate about a topic, when you hear stories from people who are passionate, it can't help but really open your mind to the possibilities. I had a similar experience a few months ago. I interviewed a Dr. Stephen Meyer, and his research is into intelligent design, something that I've never really given thought. But after that episode, I could almost feel his passion through it. And then it led me to start exploring questions. Didn't mean I necessarily believed or wanted to believe, but I thought I saw a passion in that person. I thought there's got to be a reason why they're so passionate. So that's what I've sort of got out of this book. And for everyone listening out there who may be in a similar mindset and relating to what I've said, but there, what would you say, if you could put it down to one, is the most compelling story or case that you studied that may grab someone's attention who may be brand new to this subject area?
Oh, good one. I think there's 20 odd, nearly 30 stories, I think, in the book, but there's a lot more. There's a lot more besides. There are many curves in the road and things, and things that I go off on. I think it's worth, if in case I don't mention it again, while it's on my mind, telling stories about the ghosts, for want of it, it's been with us from the beginning. By which I mean we've been writing for about 5,000 years, give or take. And from the earliest stories, there have been ghosts in the stories. I mean, one of the earliest stories that we have record of written down, older than the Old Testament, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it has in it stories that echo Noah and the flood and the rest. But it's also about a ghost. So, and that's true all the way through. So, from as long as we could write things down, people have bothered to write about the dead and the return of the dead. And that makes you think, well, before there was writing and people were just telling each other stories, just oral accounts, presumably they were telling each other ghost stories then. Yes. People speculating about life and death has always been there. And I think in the sort of scientific period that we lived through, that's maybe 300 years old, the scientific method, the science model, has driven to the edge a lot of storytelling. And it means that now in the 21st century, when we come to try and express experiences that so many people have had, we don't have up-to-date vocabulary and grammar for those stories. And people find themselves talking in antiquated ways about experiences that are of the here and now. You know, people are still having these experiences. So that's part of why I think that we have to be open-minded about all of this stuff. Just open-minded, just listen to people talk, and decide for yourself if you think that they're making it up or if they're telling the truth. Now, but to get back to your question about the most compelling, one of the stories in the book towards the end I'm Scottish, and I've had many occasions, many reasons to visit the island of Skye off the west coast of Scotland, big island off the west coast of Scotland. And over the years, I had heard tell of the wee black car, the small black car. Various people in fun and, just for want of an interesting anecdote to tell you, would give a version of the wee black car on Skye. And suffice to say, from about the 1930s up until the 1960s, more people had an encounter with the wee black car on Skye than you could count. Locals, tourists, whatever, insiders and outsiders. And the experience followed a certain format. People would be on the road, and certainly in the 1930s and 40s, the roads on Skye were single track. And with passing places, those wide spots in the road where people would pull in to let the oncoming traffic or traffic moving faster from behind go through. So the experience was quite often single track, and there was an etiquette about pulling in to let people pass. And times without number, people would see coming in the distance a wee black car, usually moving fast, giving off all the indications that the person inside it or the people inside it were in a hurry. And so the inclination was for people to pull into a passing place to let this come through. And it would be coming on fast, and then it would go into a bend or into a bit of dead ground, and it wouldn't reappear. It would just vanish. People would go, I'm there, where did that car go? And it was a recurring story that people told. And it very often happened on the road on Skye to Kyleakin, which is where if you're on Skye and you're coming to catch the ferry, there's a bridge now. For a long time, there's been a bridge back to the mainland of Scotland. But at the time that I'm talking about, the only way from Skye to the mainland of Scotland was a ferry. And most of these sightings were on the road heading for Kyleakin, which is where you would catch the boat to go across to the Kyle of Lochalsh on mainland Scotland to continue your journey. And so hundreds and hundreds of accounts of this thing down through the decades. Local kids would look out for the wee black car anytime they were out. Tourists would turn up at hotels and checking in. They would say, I had the funny thing happened. I was, on the road here and wee black car disappeared. Yeah, heard it. That happens all the time. And then I can't remember the date now, it's in the book, sometime in the 1960s, there was a tragedy. There was a queue of cars getting onto the ferry at Kyleakin, heading for mainland Scotland. And one of the cars on this particular day was a wee black car, a wee Austin, a 1934 Austin. And travelling inside it were a man and two women and a child. And there's slight variations on the account of what happened, but it would appear that the man in question was a minister, a man of the church, and he was travelling with these other three, the two women and the child. And for whatever reason, getting a car onto a ferry can be a little bit unfamiliar or a little bit anxiety-inducing for people not used to doing it. And the woman whose car it was asked the man, the minister, to get the car onto the ferry. And so they swapped places. He got into the car. She was in the passenger seat. And something happened. There was a an accident, and he drove it. The car moved at speed across the ferry and out the other side into the water. And so it landed upright in the water, and it wasn't deep, but the car was submerged, and someone jumped into the water from the ferry, tried to break the windows. The driver, managed to escape from the car, but the 2 women and the child drowned. And apparently the minister who escaped was ruined by it. It broke him, the fact that he had he'd left behind 2 women and a child who had died in the encounter. And from that day, the little black car, the wee black car, was never seen again. So after 30 years of being a regular occurrence, it stopped. No one ever saw it again. So you're left to wonder if those experiences were all some kind of collective premonition of a tragedy to come. Not a haunting from the future. Not an event that had happened in the past that was lingering, but something terrible that was yet to come. And once it came, no one ever saw the warning, because the time for warning had passed. Wow. And to me, it's one of 2 stories, really, one of a few stories in the book that I would say that haunt me. But the wee black car on Skye, I think, what is that about? So many witnesses to it before it happened.
Yes. Interesting that story ends with nobody seeing it again, because one of the questions I tend to ask around subjects like this or religion are, if people are seeing things or having experiences that then kickstart their belief, or whether that they have a preset belief and they're going out to seek validation, and whether those experiences are genuine and start a belief, or that they are just, you are almost looking for them to confirm what you already believe. But in that instance, that would counter that argument if no one's seen it since.
Yeah, I mean, it's just that there's my mum, a lot of years ago now, gave me a book. It's sometimes on my desk. I don't think it's here now. It won't be far away. It's by an astronomer, a scientist from Glasgow University called Archie Roy, a very eminent scientist, and as well as being an astronomer, and I think a physicist, but it's certainly an astronomer at Glasgow University. He was alive up until the early 1990s, I think. Can't remember when Archie Roy died, but he was a professor at Glasgow University of such renown that he happened to be the man that NASA came to plot out the orbits that the Apollo spacecraft should make in their approach to landing on the moon.
Yeah.
In 1969. He was a serious guy, a serious scientist. But also, at the same time, for about the last 10 more years of his life, he also held a chair at Glasgow University that I think was created for him, and it was the chair of parapsychology. Because he believed that the kind of events that were being described by people who were, whatever, families who were experiencing poltergeists or people who were experiencing haunted houses, disturbances, he adopted the position that was the very area that science ought to address. He said we should approach this as scientists and consider what it is that's happening, come up with hypotheses, think of experiments, test them, look at the data. He's a serious guy. And the book in question is called A Sense of Something Strange, because he said he remained agnostic, really broadly agnostic about the paranormal until the end of his life. But he said that so many experiences that he had, things that he'd heard, stories he'd been told, places that he had been, had left him with something that he could only describe as a sense of something strange. There was just something that to which he could not get to the bottom of. And I think that, ask me your question again. Just lost my train of thought.
Just whether they, people have experiences that start a new belief, or they try to validate existing beliefs.
Yes. So he went into it. He went into it as a scientist,
Yeah.
and if he had a conclusion, it was that there were. He ended up thinking that there was something, an area of phenomena that he could not explain away scientifically.
Yes.
And I think that is engaging, and it's deserving of respect. And I think that people who simply approach all of the testimony from people who seem to have experienced or seen or heard something that they can't explain, to dismiss all of that as just hocus pocus, bunkum superstition, I don't think is good enough. Because, as I said at the top of this, I've listened to so many people tell me stories like that I refuse to accept that they're all lying. Some people might have made something. Some people, maybe a percentage of the total, thought I'm gonna pull this guy's leg. I'm gonna make something up, or I'm gonna tell them the story that I used to tell my granny. I'm sure there's a sample within the total that would be that. But too many people of too many different personalities and backgrounds had something to tell me that was, you could only say, was inexplicable. I thought, I'm not convinced that you're making this up. You experienced something, and maybe at some point the science will be there. Science will be there that will explain it. That will say, yeah, this can be explained thusly. At the moment, we don't have that. We don't have that science in all of these instances. And until that moment comes, I feel I have to remain open-minded. I've remembered, when you said, what's the one that's the most compelling? There's another story that I got quite late in the day. When I was writing the book, my book agent, Eugenie, contacted me, and she said, by the by, if you're writing a book about, hauntings and so on, you really ought to speak to my friend Saskia and get her story. And I did. I phoned this woman up, and she had this story to tell about her family, and it was about her grandmother. And her grandmother, no longer among us, died some time ago. But I think if memory serves, forgive the vagueness, I think it was sometime, I think possibly in the 90s or the 80s. This lady was attending a house party in Dorset. And at this point in her life, in her 80s, she had lived in Dorset for most of her life. She'd spent decades there. She'd lived in various addresses in Dorset. And so she was in this house party, and she overheard some people talking, and she realised they were talking about a haunting. And that a young couple that she didn't know and had never previously met were describing how their house had been so haunted that they had to move out. So, her ears pricked up at this. What an interesting story. And so she kind of worked her way into the conversation and said, I've lived various places around here. I'm very interested in what you're saying. Where was this? Where did it happen? And they named the cottage and the address. And this lady, my agent's friend's grandmother, had lived there. She had lived in this cottage in the 1940s during World War II. And so now she's really interested because it's a house she remembers. She said, that cottage wasn't haunted when I was there in the 40s. And the couple said, it is now. And she said, so what is it? What's happening? What were you seeing? And they said, well, basically, more times than we want to think about, when we're sitting in the living room of an evening, there's a young woman suddenly there. And she's got brown hair, and she's young, and she's wearing a dress. and she's crying, broken-hearted, you know, thick, salty tears running down her cheeks. And then she turns and faces the fireplace, and she stands beside the fireplace, and she bangs her head on the wall. She nods forward and bumps her forehead against the wall over and over again, often enough and with enough force that we can see blood on the wall, and blood starts to run on the wallpaper, and then it's gone. And it's too upsetting. We just can't be there anymore. We can't deal with it. We've left the place now. And now this grandmother didn't say to the couple at the time, but she knew that in the 1940s, she had been living there with a toddler and a baby, her two youngest children. And she'd been, and it was the war. And her husband was away in the war. He was serving. He was an officer in the British Army, working in intelligence. And there had come a day when he had contacted her somehow, telegram or whatever, letter, phone call, I don't know, and had said, I need you to I'll go through my papers and find some information for me. And she did. She went through a briefcase or whatever, and she found, amongst other things, correspondence from another woman. And she realised that her husband was or had been having an affair. And she remembered that for a few terrible nights with her toddler and her really newborn baby alone in this cottage, husband away in the war, she had cried and cried, and she it was who had turned her face to the wall and banged her head on the wall until blood flowed. And so this lady, still alive in her 80s, was a ghost. Some aspect of her experience of trauma was still in the cottage that she'd lived in the 1940s. And now, where do you go with that? What do you make of that? Now, as I say, I've been told a lot of stories, but in this instance, why would this lady have made this up?
Yes.
Why would she? It's possible that she made it up for whatever reason, but it's also possible that she was telling the gospel truth. Yeah. And that in some way that science is yet to explain, the extreme traumatic experience of a few days or a few weeks in the 1940s, long after she had left that place, it was still there, like the perfume left behind by someone who has walked out of the room, like the cigar smoke from someone smoking a cigar who's now gone somewhere else. But you walk into the room after them and you go, perfume or cigar, some emotional residue left behind in the room. And I think, can I dismiss that as just nonsense? No, I just remain open-minded.
Yeah, that instantly reminds me of, I've heard you talk about this before, of this theory around an emotional residue being left behind in places like a battlefield where people have experiences, paranormal experiences. This idea of there being such a thing as such intense emotion, such intense trauma that it leaves behind a residue of its own that's, as you mentioned there, sort of unexplainable in scientific terms.
Yeah, I mean, why not? Why not? Why is there not a possibility that there's a scientific explanation, backup for something like that? I mean, if you imagine a battlefield, ancient or modern, somewhere that hundreds or perhaps thousands of men and boys came together in a hellish few hours, or in a hellish hour on a day or whatever, and they all collectively at the same time experienced something terrible. Then the people they left behind who mourned who maybe lived in the vicinity and came to the battlefield and found their bodies and had to deal with the bodies and burying the dead and so on and so on. So much emotion experienced and expressed in the same place at the same time. Is it so unreasonable to imagine that something of that might have lingered? And within the book, as I describe it, I think in particular in relation to the Battle at Algrim during the Williamite Wars in Ireland in the 17th century, and then again somewhere like Culloden, and then again in relation to something like the legend of the Angel of Mons in the First World War. There are innumerable accounts down through the years of people experiencing something at the time, and then in the aftermath, people revisiting that place and catching or saying, testifying, and we have no reason to believe that they're all lying, that they're catching a glimpse of something like why not? I mean, we talk about people accept that in an old-fashioned television set that was picking up, an analog television, not digital, that was picking up frequency, radio frequency, television frequency. People accept that within the white noise, in between the channels, was some of the residue left over from the Big Bang, at the start of the universe, that some of the background static from that explosion, 14 billion years ago, was still there and still detectable by, a television set in the 70s and 80s and whatever. If we accept that, why wouldn't it also be possible that in some analogous sense, another kind of frequency generated and transmitted by a shared experience 100 years ago or 500 years ago might not still be detectable? As you and I as I'm sitting here in my room and you're sitting there in your room, intellectually that data, mobile phone calls, texts, radio, television is all there in your room. And if you turned on the relevant receiver, it would be there. But you can't receive it. You can't listen to Radio 2 or Netflix without a bit of kit beside you that decodes that and translates the invisible into something that you can see. And so why isn't it also possible at the same time that some other frequency from 500 years ago, from a moment in the past, is there, like the white noise from the Big Bang 14 billion years ago? If you could turn on the right bit of kit, it would go, oh, right enough, there it is.
Yeah, that's a fantastic argument, and really something that I'm sure a lot of people will be thinking about right now as they're listening. One thing that I'd love to ask you about, from all the people you've met and talked to, is when I think of hotspots for ghost hunting, it's a very big hobby for people who actively want to go out and have an experience. For me, as you were talking, describing that the woman and the wall, I couldn't imagine anything worse than witnessing that myself, and so it doesn't appeal to me to seek out an experience. So when you look at real big ghost hunting hotspots like Pendle Hill, where they were the witch trials that so many people flock to catch a glimpse of something, why do you think they actively want to see something? What do you think they're hoping to get out of that experience? What is their benefit? What do they want to find?
I suppose it's also reasonable that I think, fear of death is one of the fundamental aspects of the human condition. Most people, if they're honest, would say that they're apprehensive, at least, about what happens next. And the idea of something like Archie Roy, Archie Roy said towards the end of his life that when he died, if he didn't if some aspect of him didn't survive, he was going to be very, very surprised. That many people hope at least that there's something after death, some survival. And that, like ghost stories, is an ancient texture to what it is to be human and alive. You know, the great unique selling point of Christianity that no other monotheism had offered up until that point, any other religion had offered really up until that point, was the idea of eternal life after death, heaven, in the presence of God. And that was a big unique selling point of Christianity, and it was a big part of why after a period of time it began to attract a lot of followers and a lot of adherents. And so likewise, where people have experienced loss, as well as worrying about what will happen to themselves when they die, perhaps even more intensely, people want to be reassured that their own loved ones who have died have not just ceased to be, that there's some survival. It's not, you'd have to have a heart of stone not to understand why a lot of people would want that. And I'm not saying that by wanting that they're deluded. Maybe they're right, but you can understand surely you can understand where that desire comes from. So, but that said, when I think, I've never gone to, well, I say in the book, I think the opening line of the book is that I've always wanted to see a ghost, which I have. I'd love it. But and I know that I've been in lots of places where a person might see a ghost. You know, I've been in castles and graveyards and battlefields and all sorts of places where people have otherwise on other days reported sightings of ghosts. But I can honestly say though that while I understand people going looking for ghosts, I haven't ever actually gone looking for. I've had moments here and there, you know, where in a location where I know that other people have experienced certain things, where for a moment I've thought, oh, I wonder if, maybe I'll see something or hear something that I can't explain, and it's, you know, it hasn't actually happened for me. But I don't dismiss people that want to go looking. I understand it. I've been in, there's lots of places I've been in the landscape, like St Nectan's Glen in Cornwall, and which is just a name that comes to mind instantly, where people go when they're experiencing intense emotion and they want reassurance from the invisible. They go to St Nectan's Glen and they leave trinkets and photographs and things in the hope that some connection will be made between here and the next world. But I say again, I've heard from too many people that they didn't go looking for the experience they had. And they're the ones that I really listen to, people that were taken by surprise by something. You know, they were just there. There's a story in the introduction to the book, a guy that I honestly, well, it's not unique. I mean, I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of people over the years, interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people for television. So, you know, and I didn't keep a diary. And so some of them, I don't remember exactly where and when, who, but as I recount in the book, I was with a guy filming. I know it was in the Highlands of Scotland. I don't think it was all that far away from here. I live in Stirling. I think it was not too far away, maybe Perthshire or somewhere relatively nearby. And we were on a wind-blasted hillside one day, 15 years ago maybe. And we were, like I said, filming days are long days. And we were doing grabbing little bits of film. He was telling us about some aspect of history. I can't remember what. Probably something to do with Jacobites. I don't know. Can't remember now. And in a gap in the filming, probably while it was raining or whatever, and it was just him and I. The camera crew were whatever 20 yards away, and he said, "Hands in pockets." A serious guy, an academic, a historian type person, and he was standing like that on the hill. And out of nowhere, he said, you know, a couple of years ago, or no, he said a lot of years ago now, I was on a road just over there. He pointed and he said, it was at night in the winter time, it was raining, terrain, dreadful night, dark, barely see, windscreen wipers, and he could see a guy on the road ahead of him walking in the same direction that he was going in. And as he got closer, he realised that the guy was hopelessly unprepared for the weather. It was like a light jacket and trousers. He was soaked to the skin. It was cold, winter. So he pulled in, wound down the window. It was way before the days of electric windows. Wound down the window and said, "Do you want a lift? Or whatever, give you a lift." And guy jumped in. Young guy, bearded. So he jumped in the passenger seat, soaking, water running off him. And my guy put his car into gear, headed off down this single track road, whatever, windscreen wipers, really having, I mean, his headlights, you know, peering ahead, just paying attention to the road. And some time had passed, and he thought, I better talk to this guy because, you know, it's been 10 minutes now. And he looked across and there was nobody there. No one in the passenger seat. The seat was dry. What the hell just happened? Now, I said something, you know, asinine, like, wow, when he told me this story. I said, I don't know what to make of that. He said, neither do I. He had hands in his pockets. He wasn't being extravagant about it. He wasn't being storytellerish about it. He just recounted it deadpan. Now, as I say, I don't think he was making that up for me. Maybe he was, 1% chance. I think something had happened to that guy 20 years previously, 30 years previously, that he couldn't explain. And he told me. And I listened to it and I thought, like you, mate, I've got no explanation for that. That's strange. Where do you go with that? He wasn't drunk. He was driving a car in the 70s. He was on his own. He was on the way from wherever, somewhere to elsewhere, picked up a guy, gone. Now, I ask you, what do you do with that, Lewis?
I mean, my as you mentioned there, my mind, the first thing I went to was he drunk? Was he, you know, was there any substances involved? That's the first place I go to. But as you mentioned there, if he's driving, that sort of eliminates that possibility. So what you're left with is, yeah, unexplainable.
If he wasn't making it up, and yeah, like you said, with ghost stories, you've always got to allow for that. You've got a file somewhere or a folder in amongst their story where you go, completely made it up.
Yeah,
this guy looked me in the eye and for whatever reason decided to tell me a completely makey-uppy story. That's possible. But the context of the guy, the thing we were talking about, it was serious academic. Why? Why would he spin me a line? Yeah. I honestly, hand on heart, if I had to testify in court, I'd say, no, I don't think the guy, I think that guy, I mean, when you start looking into these stories, you think, well, you know, people will tell you, scientific people who are looking rationally and soberly for explanations will say, well, people have their subconscious at play all the time. You have, I have, your unconscious, your subconscious. You, me, all of us, we're products of everything that's happened to us. Good and bad, light and dark, yesterday, today, 20 years ago. It's all in there. It's all in there, you know, being processed and repurposed all the time. And you've got an unconsciousness running all the time, which means that whether you're aware of it or not, you're sometimes approaching situations and approaching a next encounter. And there's stuff going on in the background, which may play into the way in which you interpret the next 10 minutes of your life. That is true. And from time to time, depending on your subconscious and your unconsciousness, that's giving you a perspective through which you are seeing the next minute of your life. So and so you do allow for all of that. But I would say that all of that is part of the necessity to not dismiss what people say and go, that's just nonsense, or you just made that up, or you were completely mistaken. You know, you saw something else that was rational, and for whatever reason, for 10 minutes, you interpreted it in a completely irrational way. I think a more mature and reasoned understanding, at the very least, would have to allow for the possibility that there's a better explanation for what these people have experienced. And I think they're experiencing phenomena. I think they're experiencing something real, which at the moment we don't properly understand, have the equipment to detect, and we don't necessarily have the framework, the context in which to understand it.
Now, stories are one thing, evidence and tangible things you can point to and look at are another. Now, I think we're entering an age where it's going to become, these conversations aren't going to be as interesting because it's so easy now to just say AI could have made that, or it's so hard to distinguish between what's real and what is fake. Deep fakes, we've seen it all. But in terms of sort of infamous old photographs now, I think one that causes a lot of debate is the photography of the brown lady.
Rainham Hall, yeah.
Yes. How do you assess visual evidence like that? And for you, when you look at that photograph, does that add or take away from the case for you?
That photograph, to me, hand on heart, looks like the classic. I mean, for people listening who don't know the story, for Country Life magazine, a photographer and assistant were in Rainham Hall, a stately home, and they were set up for a photograph. They were like, Country Life, it popularizes and tells people stories about, fancy houses, and it did it 100 years ago and it's still doing it now. And so they were there in Rainham Hall, and they were all set up for a photograph of this, quite grand. I mean, not particularly spectacular, but a wooden staircase. And as they took the photograph, apparently somebody saw something. The assistant said, "Are you seeing that?" And the photographer took the big box, old-fashioned camera, exposed the lens, put the thing back in, flash went, and when the thing was developed, there's an image of this. You can see the staircase quite clearly, but there's, well, what you might, I suppose, reasonably call a smudge in the middle of the shot that's called the Brown Lady of Rainham Hall, which is an apparition that had been described long before the age of photography, and then a photograph apparently caught the Brown Lady of Rainham Hall. And when I look at the image, it looks to me like the classic image that you get of the Virgin Mary. And if I say the Virgin Mary, for most people that have got any kind of familiarity, at least with Catholic iconography, they'll probably get an image in their head of a woman, in a gown or cloaked, really, so that it's only her face and then long clothes, and maybe her feet or her footwear exposed at the bottom of the image, and that's what it looks like to me. So it does look like a superimposition of an image of the Virgin Mary, but out of focus and smudged within this thing. But I'm only saying that because that's when I saw the image. I've seen the image many times, and that's always what I think of when I look at it. Yeah. However, and it did. I mean, it comes at it came at a time, or during a period of time when stately homes were looking for income. Safari parks and motor museums and all sorts of things were being added to stately homes as people, as times changed, and aristocratic families could no longer afford these great piles without bringing in the public. And there was a period of time during which, oh, there's a ghost here, there's a ghost there. People had amongst other things, as well as a scone and a cup of tea and a shot, a look at the lions and the giraffes, people might see a ghost. So there was all of that going on at the same time. And although Rainham never really has fitted that profile of the kind of stately home that was trying to attract the general public, all of that, it was all happening at around the time where that kind of apparition was happening elsewhere. And so I'm not particularly persuaded of that photograph. I look at it, I don't know, it's an image of, ghostly. There's a ghostly image in the foreground of a photograph, but it's not. I don't find that to be the most compelling evidence. But my not being especially convinced by that image, and it is probably one of the most, if not the most famous images of a ghost ever taken in England. But my not being especially persuaded one way or another about the authenticity or otherwise of that image does not diminish and does not in any way close my open-mindedness about other people's experiences in other places. And that the Rainham Hall picture is only one. We've all seen them. There's stuff on telly all the time. Haunted this, haunted that, whatever, glimpses of this, that, and the other. But bogus, if it is bogus stuff does not necessarily, does not in any sense mean that everybody else's testimony is unreliable.
I think a great place to wind down this conversation is, this book is around locations in Britain, and you've done many programs and projects on the history of Britain. And when I think of the landscape of Britain and my experience, it does seem like the perfect place to go hand in hand with ghost stories. Now, I think of where I grew up in South Wales valleys, and all around you are very wooded areas. There are a lot of I just thinking back to the walk between my house as a child and the local town centre. You'd have to walk down this trail, and there were trees arching over, and it's quite an eerie place. And you look up, and I lived in a valley, so you have these big overarching mountains. You'd have the mist coming over the mountains. Britain to me just seems like the perfect place for ghost stories. What do you think it is about Britain that just goes hand in hand with so many famous ghost stories and hauntings?
That's a good question. I think it often sounds like a strange thing to say, because people think, well, the world's here, and the continents and the countries, whatever, have always been here, or the landscapes have always been here. But the fact remains that in our archipelago, the countries have been here for a long time when you come to comparing them to countries elsewhere in Europe. Yeah. For example, there's been an England for 1,000 years, understanding itself as a place with a name. And likewise, Wales, Wales and the Cymru have been there for a long time, understanding themselves in an unbroken tradition, decade after decade, century after century, millennium after millennium, mythology going back, beyond the reach of time. Scotland, again, Ireland, these are places that have felt themselves to be real and have been populated by populations handing down generation after generation after. I mean, it's all up for play now. I mean, there's a lot of flux going on in the world now, right now, and it has been for 10 or 20 years. But up until that point, these were old places. And Welsh, you're talking about Wales, Welsh mythology. It reaches back, deep, deep roots, going all the way back. And so, the idea of what we used to call, when I was a child, Chinese whispers. Yeah. The idea that something gets passed, send reinforcements, we're going to advance, becomes send 3 and 4pence, we're going to a dance. That old anecdote. Yeah. Stories get passed down through the generations, and a bit like like the 14th photocopy of the original. In the days when we had photocopiers, it gets a bit blurred. If you keep photocopying from the photocopy, you lose the definition. So the focus, things become a bit blurred and harder to interpret. If you're looking at the original copy, the original thing, then a photocopy, then a photocopy of that photocopy, and a photocopy of the photocopy of the photocopy. You go all the way down, you end up with something that's a bit hard to look at. And you might look at that and get it wrong. You might you might not, whatever, the Brown Lady of Rainham Hall. But that's not to say that if you could actually go from that blurred image back to the original, you might go, right, I get it. Yeah. And some aspect of it is still there in the blurred copy. You say, right, yes, I see why people have seen that, but it's really this. You take out all the intervening blurring. And so I think that because we live in countries that are old and they have long, long traditions of folk story, and people in the modern era, in the 21st century, are invited to think that, it's all just fairies and dragons and all the other things that that people might associate with Welsh legend or Celtic legend or Anglo-Saxon folklore and myth. It's all just nonsense. It's not. It has within it, if you could get a clearer definition, if you could get away from the smudging of time, you'd get back to the precise, sharp image. And some of it's still there. So in answer to your question, when you say, why is this such a place of ghost stories? It's because there's been people here for thousands of years telling the same stories over and over and over again, down through the generations. And within them, what we've got now in the 21st century, there's a bit of the truth. It's a bit indistinct. It's got a bit vague. Because of the retelling and the retelling, send 3 and 4pence, we're going to a dance. It's a little bit vague, but some aspect, the truth is still in it. And so that, that's why, and that's true all over the place. You go all over the place. There are ancient cultures, in China, in Japan, in Africa, in Central America, in South America, in the indigenous, when you get in Australia, when you get in amongst the indigenous populations and you listen to what it is that they're saying, the Australian, like as you talked about ancient wisdom, and within the Australian Aboriginal, the indigenous population's tradition, they talk about, or they seem to talk about, droughts that happened tens of thousands of years ago, and they seem to talk about meteorites striking the earth tens of thousands of years ago. They seem to have a folk memory of things that happened in geological time. And it's possible that they do, possible that they don't, but it's at least possible that they do. And when you've got those long traditions coming down, the reason that those stories keep on getting passed generation after generation, however they get slightly confused and there's maybe inconsistencies and mistakes creep in, the reason that they keep on being told is because at the heart of them, they're true. there's truth. That's why they last. They last precisely because they're not nonsense. People aren't stupid. Nonsense gets dismissed. People hold on to the truth and they keep passing it. And it maybe gets a little bit, indistinct, a little bit smudged around the edges. But but people hold on to it because it's true. And as I said at the beginning, people have been telling each other stories about the survival of the spirit or something after death since the very beginning, which means that even before there was writing, people were telling each other that. And there has to be a really, really good reason why those stories have lasted as long as they have.
I think we've just brought it perfectly full circle. Really appreciate that explanation. And you put it so poetically. I'm sure everyone will agree. Now, before I let you go, please, let's let these guys know, because I have this book on Audible, but I will be getting a hard copy soon to go next to my copy of Wisdom of the Ancients. Please let everyone listening know where they can find the book and more of your work. There we go. Beautiful cover, by the way. Props to the team. Yes. Wow.
Yeah. That's Transworld. This is my fourth book, I think, now for Transworld, and I love the design team that look after all of that. I think it's a perfect kind of Halloween. Really, it came out around Halloween time. I think it's lovely book. It's available. I always say, go after your local independent bookshop.
Yeah.
On your wherever it is, down a side street, on your high street. If there's somebody there selling books, go there. And all the other sources besides. Yes, there's an Audible version. I recorded the story myself as well, so that you can have me in your ear if you want. I'll say right up, I've always been, the books I've written in the past, really, although I suppose with Wisdom of the Ancients, that was the first time I kind of allowed myself to speculate a bit more, moving a little bit away from straight history to a little bit of philosophizing. And this one's kind of like the next that takes that latitude, and I allowed myself to just dream a little bit, and as well as telling giving the historical background to places like Ulgrim and Culloden and the Tower of London and Windsor Castle, and places familiar and places unfamiliar. I just allowed myself to open up a little bit and think, what if?
Well, I'm very, very glad you did, sir. Thank you so much for joining me again. Third time on the podcast, and I hope that it's not too long until you're back on the show for a fourth time.
Lewis, honestly, I say this hand on heart. I'm not blowing smoke. Yours, I'll come back to you anytime. I love your podcast, and I just thoroughly enjoy a conversation with you. So bring on the next one.